The night was cold and bitter when Kyle Martinez heard the sound that would change his life forever. He was sitting in his small apartment on the 5th floor of a crumbling building in Chicago, and the heater had broken again, and his landlord refused to answer the phone. Kyle worked 2 jobs just to afford this place, and even then he could barely pay rent. He was eating instant noodles for the 3rd night in a row when he heard the crash on his fire escape. At first he thought it was just the wind knocking over the old flower pots his previous tenant had left behind. But then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a cry of pain, soft and weak but definitely not human. Kyle grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and slowly walked to the window. What he saw made him drop the bat in shock. A woman lay sprawled on the metal grating of the fire escape, and she was unlike anyone Kyle had ever seen. Her skin was pale blue like moonlight reflecting off snow, and it seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair was long and silver, and it floated around her head as if she was underwater. Her ears were pointed and extended several inches from her head. She wore armor that looked like it was made from living metal, and it pulsed with a dim, purple light that was fading blood pooled beneath her, and it was not red like human blood but silver, and it shimmered like liquid mercury. Beside her were 2 small creatures that Kyle first thought were cats, but then he saw the scales and the wings and the small horns, and he realized with absolute terror that they were dragons. They were no bigger than kittens, and they were making distressed chirping sounds as they nudged the woman. Trying to wake her, Kyle stood frozen for a moment, and his mind could not process what he was seeing. Dragons were not real, and blue women with pointed ears were not real. And this had to be some kind of dream. Or maybe he had finally lost his mind from stress and exhaustion. But then the woman opened her eyes and looked directly at him. Her eyes were violet and enormous, and they held such pain and desperation that Kyle felt his heart break. She lifted one trembling hand toward him and whispered something in a language he had never heard before. It sounded like wind chimes and distant bells, and somehow Kyle understood that she was begging him to help. Kyle did not think about what he was doing. He unlocked his window and climbed out onto the fire escape, and the metal was freezing under his bare feet. The woman tried to move away from him, and one of the small dragons hissed and tiny flames came from its mouth. But she was too weak, and she collapsed again. Up close, Kyle could see that she had a terrible wound on her side. It looked like something had burned through her armor and into her flesh, and the edges of the wound were blackened and still smoking. The woman was shaking from cold or pain or both, and the 2 small dragons were trying to keep her warm with their bodies. Kyle had no idea what to do, but he knew he could not just leave her out here to die. He was a good person, and his mother had raised him to help people who needed help even when it was hard. So Kyle carefully slid his arms under the woman and lifted her, and she was surprisingly light despite the armor. She made a weak sound of protest but did not have the strength to fight him. He carried her inside his apartment, and the 2 small dragons followed immediately. They flew through the window on wings that seemed too small to carry them and landed on his couch. Kyle laid the woman on his bed, which was really just a mattress on the floor, and grabbed every towel he owned. He pressed them against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, and when she was awake, she kept whispering in that strange musical language. Kyle wished he could understand her, but he just kept telling her that she would be okay, even though he had no idea if that was true. The dragons climbed onto the bed and curled against her, and Kyle noticed that one of them had scales that shifted from green to blue, and the other had scales that went from white to pale silver. Kyle had a small first aid kit in his bathroom, and he brought it even though he knew it was meant for human injuries, not whatever this woman was. He had some antibiotic ointment and gauze and medical tape. He very carefully cleaned the wound as best he could, and the woman screamed, and the sound was horrible, and the dragons hissed at him, but he kept going because he had to try to help. When he was done, he covered her with his only good blanket and his winter coat because she was so cold. He found a bottle of water and helped her drink a little, and she managed to swallow some before she passed out again. Kyle sat on the floor beside his bed and watched her breathe and prayed that she would survive the night. The dragons eventually stopped hissing at him, and one of them, the green and blue one, crept closer and sniffed his hand. Kyle stayed very still, and after a moment the small dragon crawled into his lap and curled up. It was warm, and it made a sound like a cat purring. The other dragon, the white and silver one, stayed with the woman. Kyle did not sleep at all that night. He kept checking to make sure the woman was still breathing, and he changed the bandages when they soaked through with that strange silver blood. Several times she woke and looked at him with those violet eyes and seemed confused about where she was. Kyle just smiled at her and told her she was safe now. What Kyle did not know was that at that exact moment, his face was being broadcast across the entire galaxy, Every screen on every ship and every station and every planet suddenly showed the same image. It showed Kyle Martinez in his threadbare pajamas and his messy apartment pressing towels against an alien wound, while two baby dragons kept watch. It showed him giving water to a stranger and covering her with his coat, and staying awake all night to make sure she survived. The transmission went everywhere. It reached the proud warrior species who lived for battle. It reached the cold logical machines who only understood data. It reached the merchant guilds who valued profit above all else. It reached empires that had existed for millions of years and had never heard of Earth or humans, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing and watched. They watched a human who had nothing share everything he had. They watched a human who had every reason to be afraid choose compassion instead. They watched a human save someone who could offer him nothing in return. In the royal fleet of the starborn elves, alarms were blaring, and the entire council had gathered in emergency session. Their princess was missing and presumed dead, and now they were seeing her on some primitive backwater planet being tended to by a creature they had never considered important. The head counselor who had ordered the assassination of Princess Lyra felt fear for the first time in centuries because the whole universe was watching. On Earth, Kyle had no idea that anything unusual was happening. He just sat with a dying woman and two small dragons and hoped that morning would bring answers. The woman whispered something and Kyle leaned close. She said one word in English and her accent was strange, but he understood. She said thank you. And then she closed her eyes and Kyle prayed she would open them again. Morning came slowly and Kyle had not moved from his spot on the floor. The woman was still breathing, but her skin had lost some of its glow and she felt cold even under all the blankets. The two small dragons had stayed with her all night, and Kyle noticed they seemed to be getting weaker too. He wondered if they needed food or water or something else he could not provide. Kyle knew he should go to work, but he could not leave her alone like this. He called his manager at the grocery store and said he was sick, and he could hear the anger in his manager's voice because Kyle had already missed 3 days last month when he had the flu. His manager told him not to bother coming back, and Kyle felt his stomach drop because he needed that job desperately. But he looked at the woman dying in his bed and knew he had made the right choice. He tried to give the dragons some water, but they would not drink. The green and blue one that had slept in his lap kept looking at him with intelligent eyes that seemed far too aware for an animal. Kyle opened his nearly empty refrigerator and found some leftover chicken, and he tore it into small pieces and offered it to the dragons. They sniffed it carefully and then ate it quickly, and Kyle felt relieved that at least they would not starve. The woman woke up around noon and she seemed more alert than before. She looked around his apartment, taking in the peeling wallpaper and the second-hand furniture, and the single window that looked out at another brick building. Kyle brought her water and she drank it gratefully. Then she spoke, and this time Kyle could understand some of the words she said. Her name was Lyra, and she was a princess of a people called the Starborn, and she had been betrayed by her own council and left to die on Earth because Earth was so primitive that no one would ever think to look for her here. She said the dragons were named Ember and Frost, and they were sacred creatures that only bonded with those they deemed worthy. She said she did not know why Kyle had saved her, but that he had done something very dangerous because now people would be looking for her. Kyle listened to all of this and tried to process it, but his brain felt like it was overloading. He told her his name and that he worked at a grocery store, except he probably did not anymore, and that he had saved her because she needed help. And that was what good people did. Lyra looked at him like he had said something profound, and Kyle felt embarrassed. She tried to sit up but gasped in pain, and Kyle helped her lean against the wall. He asked if there was anyone he could call or any way to get her help, and Lyra shook her head. She said her people would come eventually, but she did not know if they would come to rescue her or finish killing her. She said the council had decided she was too dangerous because she wanted peace with other species and they wanted war and power. Kyle made her soup from a can because it was all he had, and Lyra ate it slowly and said it was the strangest food she had ever tasted, but it was warm and she was grateful. The dragons Ember and Frost climbed onto Kyle's shoulders, and he froze because he was terrified they would burn him or bite him, but they just settled there like birds and made their purring sounds across the galaxy. The transmission continued and billions of beings watched. Kyle feed soup to an alien princess and let her dragons perch on his shoulders. They watched him give up his job to stay with someone he had just met. They watched him use his last bit of money to buy medicine at the corner pharmacy because he thought it might help her healthy. Warrior race called the Krell held an emergency assembly, and their war chief stood before thousands of soldiers and showed them the transmission. He said that humans might look weak and soft, but this one had more honor than most Krell warriors. and that any species capable of producing such individuals deserved respect. The Krell fleet changed course and began heading toward Earth. The synthetic collective that had no emotions and only processed pure logic struggled to understand Kyle Martinez's actions. They ran millions of calculations trying to find the benefit to him for saving Lyra, and found none. He had lost income and risked danger and received nothing in return. The synthetics concluded that humans operated on principles that transcended pure logic, and they found this fascinating. They began studying Earth and humans with intense interest. The merchant guilds watched Kyle spend money he did not have on someone who could not pay him back, and they were confused, but also intrigued. The guildmaster called a meeting and said that perhaps they had been wrong to judge species only by their wealth and resources. Perhaps there was value in compassion and honor that could not be measured in credits on Earth. Kyle had no idea that he had become the most famous human in the galaxy. He just tried to keep Lyra comfortable and figure out what to do next. Lyra told him stories about the stars and showed him images on her armor, which could project holographic displays. She showed him worlds made entirely of crystal and nebulas that sang in stations where millions of different species lived together. Kyle was amazed by all of it. But what struck him most was how sad Lyra looked when she talked about her home. She told him that her people had once been explorers and artists and philosophers, but over the centuries they had become cold and paranoid and obsessed with maintaining their power. She had tried to change things, and that was why they wanted her dead. Kyle told her about his life and how he had dropped out of college because his mother got sick and he had to work to pay her medical bills, and then she died anyway, and he never went back to school. He told her about his dreams of maybe someday being a teacher, because he loved learning and wanted to help kids who came from difficult situations like he had. Lyra listened like his words were the most important thing she had ever heard. Over the next 2 days, Lyra grew stronger and the wound began to heal, though it left a terrible scar. Kyle helped her walk around his apartment so she would not lose her strength, and Ember and Frost flew circles around them. The dragons were growing bigger, and Kyle noticed they were about the size of large cats now, and he wondered how big they would eventually get. Lyra taught Kyle some words in her language, and he taught her more English, and they laughed. When they both got words wrong, Kyle found himself looking forward to talking with her, and he realized that he had been lonely for a very long time. He had not had a real friend since high school, and working 2 jobs had left no time for a social life. On the 3rd day, Lyra sat Kyle down and told him something important. She said that Ember and Frost had bonded with him, and that meant they had chosen him as their companion. She said this was extremely rare because dragons were sacred and ancient, and they could see into a person's soul and only bonded with those who were truly good. She said Kyle was now connected to the dragons for life, and that he would need to learn how to care for them and work with them. Kyle looked at the 2 dragons who were curled up on his couch, and he felt overwhelmed. He was just a guy who worked at a grocery store and could barely take care of himself. And now he had 2 dragons and an alien princess in his apartment, and apparently the universe was watching. He asked Lyra what happened next, and she smiled sadly and said she did not know, but that she was glad she had met him, because he had restored her faith that goodness still existed. What neither of them knew was that Lyra's people were coming, and they were bringing an armada because half the galaxy had demanded it, and the council that had tried to kill her was about to face justice, and Kyle Martinez. Life would never be the same again. On the 5th day after Kyle had found Lyra on his fire escape, he woke up to find his apartment filled with a strange blue light. He jumped up from the couch where he had been sleeping and saw that Lyra was standing by the window, and her armor was glowing brighter than he had ever seen it. Ember and Frost were flying in tight circles around the room and making sounds that Kyle had learned meant they were excited or nervously. Returned to look at him, and her violet eyes were wide with fear and hope. She said they were coming, and Kyle asked who, and she said everyone. Kyle did not understand what that meant, but he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out the window and saw nothing unusual. Just the normal Chicago morning with cars honking and people walking to work. Then the sky split open and Kyle fell backward in shock. A massive ship appeared out of nowhere, and it hung in the air above the city like an impossible dream. It was beautiful and terrifying, and it looked like it was made from the same living metal as Lyra's armor. More ships appeared, and then more, until the sky was filled with them. They came in every shape and size and color, and Kyle realized these were ships from different species from across the galaxy. People on the street were screaming and pointing and taking pictures with their phones. Cars crashed as drivers looked up instead of at the road. Sirens started blaring from every direction. Kyle could hear his neighbors shouting in confusion and fear. The television in his apartment turned on by itself, and every channel showed the same thing. News anchors were panicking as they tried to explain what was happening. A beam of light shot down from the largest ship, and it landed right outside Kyle's building. He watched as figures materialized in the light, and his breath caught because they were Lyra's people. They were tall and elegant with that same pale blue skin and pointed ears, and they wore armor that gleamed. Behind them came other beings that were definitely not human. There were massive creatures that looked like they were made of rock. There were floating orbs of pure energy. There were insect-like beings and cat-like beings and beings that Kyle could not even begin to describe. Lyra grabbed Kyle's hand and squeezed it and said she was sorry for bringing this to his world. Kyle wanted to tell her it was okay, but he could not find his voice. There was a knock on his door that sounded like thunder, and Kyle opened it with shaking hands. Standing in his hallway was the most intimidating person Kyle had ever seen. She was one of the Starborn like Lyra, but older, and she wore armor covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift. Behind her were a dozen guards carrying weapons that hummed with energy. The woman looked at Kyle and then at Lyra, and her expression softened. She said her name was Commander Vera, and she was Lyra's sister, and she had come to bring Lyra home. Lyra stepped forward, and there was tension in her posture like she was ready to fight. She asked Vera if the council had sent her to finish what they started. Vera shook her head and said the council no longer controlled anything because the entire galaxy had watched Kyle save Lyra, and public opinion had turned against them. Vera explained that the transmission of Kyle saving Lyra had gone out across every system and every species, and it had sparked something that no one had expected. Species that had been enemies for centuries had called truces to discuss what they had seen. Warrior races had declared Kyle a hero of the highest order. The logical synthetics had begun philosophical debates about the nature of compassion. The merchant guilds had donated resources to help find Lyra. The council that had tried to kill Lyra had been arrested and would face trial for treason and attempted murder. Vera said that Lyra was being called back home, not as a prisoner but as a leader, because the people wanted change, and they wanted the peace that Lyra had always fought for. The galaxy had seen what one act of kindness could do, and they wanted more of that in their own societies. Kyle listened to all of this and felt like he was in a dream. Vera turned to him and bowed deeply, which shocked him because she seemed like royalty and he was just a grocery store worker who had just been fired. Vera said that Kyle Martinez had done what entire armies could not do. He had united the galaxy through simple compassion and courage. She said every species wanted to meet him and thank him and offer him honor. Kyle did not know what to say, so he just stood there feeling stupid in his old pajamas. Lyra stepped close to him and took his hand again and said that she wanted Kyle to come with her to the stars. She said Ember and Frost had chosen him, and that meant he was bonded to them for life and that he belonged with them. She said Earth was about to be welcomed into the galactic community and that Kyle would be remembered as the first human to show the universe what humanity was truly capable of. Kyle looked around his tiny apartment with its broken heater and peeling paint and his empty refrigerator. He thought about his dead-end jobs and his student loans and his lonely life. Then he looked at Lyra with her violet eyes full of hope and at Ember and Frost who were perched on his shoulders, like they belonged there. He thought about the stars and all the worlds Lyra had shown him. But then he thought about Earth and all the people here who were probably terrified right now. He asked Vera what would happen to his world, and Vera smiled and said that Earth would be protected and guided and welcomed as a new member of the galactic community. She said humans had proven they had something precious to offer and that the galaxy wanted to learn from them as much as teach them. There was another knock on the door, and this time it was Kyle's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who was 70 years old and made him soup when he was sick. She looked at the alien beings in the hallway and then at Kyle and asked if he was okay. Kyle almost laughed because it was such a normal question in such an abnormal situation. He told her he was fine, and Mrs. Chen nodded and said good, because the whole building was worried about him. That simple interaction seemed to break the tension, and Kyle realized that this was real and happening and he had to make a choice. Vera said they needed to leave soon because more ships were arriving, and Earth governments were starting to panic and they needed to establish proper first contact protocols. She said Kyle could come with them or stay on Earth. But either way, his life had changed forever. Vera said she would understand if Kyle wanted to stay, because she knew how hard it was to leave home. But her eyes were sad, like she had already lost something precious. Ember and Frost made distressed sounds and pressed closer to Kyle, and he could feel their emotions somehow. They did not want to leave him. Kyle thought about his mother, who had always told him to be brave and kind and to help people who needed help. She had worked 3 jobs to raise him alone, and she had never complained, and she had always believed he would do something important with his life. Kyle wished she could see him now and know that her lessons had mattered. He made his decision and told Vera he would go. But he needed to do something first. He grabbed his phone and called his landlord and quit his apartment. He called his other job and officially quit that too. He packed a small bag with some clothes and the picture of his mother that sat by his bed. Then he wrote a note to Mrs. Chen thanking her for being kind to him and asking her to tell anyone who asked that he was okay when he was done. Kyle stood in his apartment one last time and said goodbye to the only life he had ever known. Then he walked out with Lyra and Vera and the dragons and stepped into the beam of light that would carry him to the stars. As they rose into the air, Kyle looked down and saw thousands of people watching and pointing and taking pictures. He saw his building and his neighborhood and his city getting smaller. Inside the ship, Kyle was overwhelmed by technology he could not understand, and beings from species he had never imagined. But Lyra stayed close to him, and Ember and Frost never left his shoulders, and somehow that made it less scary. Vera took them to a chamber with windows that showed Earth hanging in space, and Kyle saw his whole world from the outside for the first time. And he cried, because it was so beautiful and so fragile. The journey through space took 3 days, even though Vera said they were traveling faster than light, which Kyle could not wrap his mind around. Lyra stayed with him the whole time, teaching him about the galaxy and the different species and the way things worked beyond Earth. Kyle learned that there were thousands of intelligent species in millions of worlds, and that humans were considered very young and primitive, but that was about to change. Ember and Frost grew rapidly on the ship, and by the second day they were the size of large dogs. They could speak now not with words but directly into Kyle's mind, and it was strange and wonderful. Ember had a personality that was bold and fierce and protective, while Frost was calm and thoughtful and curious. They told Kyle that they had been waiting their whole short lives for him, and that the bond between them was sacred and unbreakable. Kyle met other beings on the ship, and everyone wanted to talk to him. A Krell warrior named Thane, who stood 8 feet tall and had 4 arms, told Kyle that he had more honor than most Krell, and that was the highest compliment Thane could give. A synthetic named Unit 703 asked Kyle endless questions about human emotions and decision-making, because it wanted to understand why Kyle had acted against his own self-interest. A merchant from the guild, whose name Kyle could not pronounce, gave Kyle a datapad loaded with more credits than Kyle had made in his entire life. The merchant said it was payment for teaching the guilds that some things were more valuable than money. Kyle tried to give it back, but the merchant insisted and said that Kyle had earned it by being himself. Lyra introduced Kyle to the concept of the Galactic Council, which was made up of representatives from every major species, and they made decisions that affected everyone. She said the council had been corrupt for a long time, with the powerful species controlling everything, and the weaker ones having no voice. But Kyle's actions had inspired a movement for reform and equality. On the 3rd day they arrived at the starborn homeworld, which was called Etheria, and Kyle gasped when he saw it. The planet was covered in cities that looked like they were made of crystal and light, and they floated in the air, connected by bridges that seemed to be made of pure energy. There were forests that glowed with bioluminescence, and oceans that were silver like Lyra's blood, and mountains that touched the clouds. The ship landed at the royal palace, which was enormous and beautiful and intimidating. Thousands of Starborn had gathered to welcome Lyra home, and when she appeared they cheered so loudly that Kyle covered his ears. They were chanting her name and calling her the Peacebringer and the hope of their people. Lyra looked overwhelmed and happy and terrified all at once. But then the crowd saw Kyle, and the cheering got even louder. They were chanting his name too, and calling him the Kind One and the Dragon Chosen and the Bridge Between Worlds. Kyle felt his face turn red, and he wanted to hide. But Lyra took his hand and led him forward. Ember and Frost flew above them, breathing small jets of flame and ice, and the crowd gasped in awe because dragons were sacred and had not been seen in public for generations. Vera led them into the palace, and Kyle tried not to stare at everything, but it was impossible. The walls seemed to be alive and shifted colors as he walked past. There were floating platforms that moved without any visible means of support. There were gardens growing inside the building with plants that sang when you got close to them. They entered a massive throne room, and Kyle saw the old council members in chains being guarded by soldiers. They looked angry and afraid, and when they saw Lyra, they started shouting that she was a traitor and that she would destroy their people. Lyra ignored them and walked to the throne, which was empty. Vera gestured for Lyra to sit, and Lyra hesitated. Before finally taking her place, Evra addressed the assembled crowd and said that Lyra would be crowned as the new queen of the Starborn, and that she would lead them into a new era of peace and cooperation with other species. The crowd cheered again, and Kyle felt proud of Lyra. Even though he had only known her for a week, she had been through so much and she had never lost her belief that things could be better. Then Vera did something unexpected. She called Kyle forward and told him to kneel. Kyle was confused, but he obeyed, and Vera placed a hand on his shoulder. She said that Kyle Martinez of Earth was being granted the title of Dragon Lord, which had not been given to anyone in 1,000 years. She said he was now officially a member of the Starborn royal family and that he would serve as the ambassador between Earth and the galactic community. Kyle tried to protest because he was not qualified for any of that, but Vera just smiled and said that he had already proven himself in the way that mattered most. She said the galaxy did not need more warriors or politicians or merchants. It needed people who understood compassion and kindness, and Kyle embodied those qualities. The ceremony continued with speeches and celebrations, and Kyle felt lost in all of it. But whenever he started to panic, Lyra would catch his eye and smile at him, and he would feel better. Ember and Frost stayed close to him, and their presence was comforting. They told him through their mental link that he was doing great and that they were proud of him. Later that night, after all the ceremonies were done, Lyra found Kyle standing on a balcony, looking up at the stars. She joined him and they stood in comfortable silence for a while. Kyle finally asked her what happened now, and Lyra said that the real work was just beginning. She said they had to rebuild trust with other species and reform the government and figure out how to integrate Earth into the galactic community without overwhelming them. Kyle said he did not know how to be an ambassador or a dragon lord or any of the things they were calling him. Lyra laughed and said she did not know how to be a queen, but they would figure it out together. She said that Kyle had already done the hardest part, which was choosing to care about someone who was not his responsibility. Everything else was just details. Over the next few weeks, Kyle began his new life, and it was harder than he had expected. He had to learn new languages and customs and technologies. He had to attend meetings with alien dignitaries and represent Earth, even though he had never left Chicago before a month ago. He had to train with Ember and Frost, who were growing bigger every day and learning to use their powers. But Kyle also found joy in his new life. He made friends with beings from across the galaxy who appreciated him for who he was. He learned things he had never dreamed of learning. He got to explore worlds that took his breath away, and he got to work alongside Lyra, who he was starting to realize meant more to him than just a friend he had saved. Lyra was working tirelessly to reform the Starborn government and reach out to other species. She proposed a new galactic council where every species would have an equal vote, regardless of their military or economic power. The idea was controversial, but many species supported it because they were inspired by what they had seen Kyle do. If a human with nothing could choose compassion, then surely advanced civilizations could do the same. The Krell offered to protect Earth while humanity adjusted to knowing they were not alone in the universe. The Synthetics offered to share technology that would help solve Earth's environmental and medical problems. The merchant guilds offered trade agreements that would make Earth wealthy beyond imagination, and dozens of other species offered friendship and alliance. Kyle worked with human leaders through video calls and helped them understand what was happening. The President of the United States asked Kyle how Earth should proceed, and Kyle said they should be honest and kind, and remember that everyone in the galaxy was just trying to survive and find meaning. The President laughed and said that was not the kind of diplomatic answer she expected, but it was probably the right one. Earth began to change as humans learned they were part of something bigger. Religion struggled with the implications while scientists celebrated. There was fear and confusion, but also excitement and hope. Kyle became a symbol for humanity, and every day people sent him messages thanking him for showing the galaxy that humans were good people. Late at night when Kyle could not sleep, he would sit with Ember and Frost and think about his old life. He missed his small apartment sometimes and Mrs. Chen and the simple routine of going to work. But then he would remember that he had found purpose and friendship and adventure. He had found Lyra, who challenged him and believed in him. He had found a whole galaxy that needed what he had to offer. One night Lyra found him on the balcony again, and she sat close to him. She said she had something to tell him, and Kyle could hear the nervousness in her voice. She said that over the past weeks she had come to care for him deeply, and not just as the person who saved her life, but as someone special. Kyle felt his heart race, and he told her he felt the same way. They sat together under alien stars and talked about the future, and for the first time since leaving Earth, Kyle felt like he was exactly where he belonged. 6 months had passed since Kyle left Earth, and his life had become something he never could have imagined. He stood in the new Galactic Council chamber that had been built on a neutral station between galaxies and watched as representatives from hundreds of species gathered for the first session under the new equal voting system that Lyra had fought so hard to establish. Kyle wore formal robes that marked him as the Dragon Lord and Ambassador of Earth, and he still felt ridiculous in them, but Ember and Frost told him he looked impressive. The two dragons were now the size of horses, and they were magnificent with scales that shimmered and eyes that glowed with intelligence. They lay on either side of his chair like guards, and no one dared to approach Kyle without their permission. Lyra sat at the head of the council as the elected leader. Because she had won the vote by an overwhelming majority, she wore a crown made of living crystal, and her armor had been updated with symbols that represented peace and unity. She caught Kyle's eye across the room and smiled, and Kyle felt his heart do that thing it always did when she looked at him. They had been together now for 3 months, and Kyle had never been happier. The first order of business was formally welcoming Earth into the galactic community. Kyle stood and addressed the council in the common language he had worked so hard to learn. He spoke about humanity and their flaws and their potential. He talked about how humans were young and made mistakes, but they were also capable of great compassion and creativity. He asked the council to be patient with Earth as they learned and grew. A Krell representative stood and said that the Krell had been watching Earth closely, and they were impressed by human resilience and courage. He said humans had survived wars and disasters and diseases, and they kept trying to be better. The Krell offered to establish a military exchange program where humans could learn from Krell warriors, and Krell could learn human tactics. A synthetic representative proposed sharing medical technology that would eliminate most human diseases and extend human lifespans. A merchant representative offered trade routes that would bring resources Earth desperately needed. A scholar representative, from a species Kyle still could not pronounce, correctly offered to build universities on Earth where humans could learn about the galaxy owned by one species, offered help and friendship, and Kyle felt overwhelmed by their generosity. He thanked them all and promised that humanity would work hard to be worthy of their support. The council voted unanimously to accept Earth, and the chamber erupted in cheers. Kyle looked at Lyra and saw tears in her violet eyes, because this was what she had always dreamed of. After the session ended, there was a celebration, and Kyle found himself talking to beings from across the galaxy. They all wanted to know about Earth and humans and what it was like to be the first human to leave his world. Kyle answered their questions as best he could and tried not to sound stupid. Ember and Frost helped by projecting images into the minds of those around them, showing Earth and its beauty. Later, Kyle and Lyra escaped to a quiet observation deck where they could see the stars. Ember and Frost had gone off to explore the station with some young dragons from other species, and Kyle was grateful for the privacy. Lyra leaned against him and sighed happily. She said she could not believe they had actually done it, and Kyle said he could not believe any of this was really. Ra told Kyle that she had received a message from Earth, and his story had inspired millions of people. There were now schools named after him and charities using his name, and he had become a symbol of what humanity could be. Kyle felt embarrassed, but Lyra said he should be proud, because he had changed the galaxy, just by being himself. Kyle asked Lyra what she wanted to do next, and she said she wanted to keep building the peace and making sure every species had a voice. But she also said she wanted to spend more time with Kyle because being a queen was exhausting, and he made her happy. Kyle kissed her and told her he loved her, and Lyra said she loved him too. And Kyle marveled at how a cold night in Chicago had led to this moment. The next day, Kyle received a transmission from Earth, and it was from Mrs. Chen, his old neighbor. She was crying happy tears and saying how proud she was of him and how she told everyone that she knew Kyle was special. She said his old apartment building had been turned into a museum, and people came from all over to see where the Dragon Lord had lived. Kyle laughed and cried at the same time over. The following months, Kyle traveled across the galaxy with Lyra, visiting different worlds and species. They went to the Krell homeworld, where Kyle sparred with warriors who could have killed him easily, but treated him with respect. They went to the synthetic core, where Kyle saw artificial intelligence that had achieved consciousness and debated philosophy. They went to the merchant hub, where Kyle learned about economics that spanned galaxies. Everywhere they went, Kyle represented humanity and tried to show that humans were worth knowing. He made mistakes sometimes and said the wrong thing or misunderstood customs, but people were patient with him because they knew he was trying. Ember and Frost grew more powerful and became celebrities themselves, because dragons were rare, and seeing them work with a human was extraordinary. Earth began to change rapidly as new technology and knowledge flowed in. Humans cured diseases and solved hunger, and started to explore their own solar system with help from other species. There were problems too because some humans were afraid of change and some aliens looked down on humans for being primitive. But overall the integration was going well. Kyle worked with human leaders to establish Earth government that could interact with the Galactic Council. He helped write treaties and trade agreements. He mediated disputes between humans and aliens. He was exhausted most of the time, but he loved the work because he was making a difference. 1 year after Kyle had saved Lyra on his fire escape, the Galactic Council held a special ceremony. They unveiled a monument at the station that showed Kyle holding Lyra, while Ember and Frost watched over them. The inscription said in a dozen languages that one act of kindness had united the galaxy, and that compassion was the greatest power in the universe. Kyle stood in front of the monument feeling strange because he still did not think of himself as a hero. He was just a guy who had helped someone who needed help. But Lyra took his hand and said that was exactly what made him special. She said the galaxy had been so focused on power and wealth and military might that they had forgotten what really mattered, and Kyle had reminded them. The ceremony ended with representatives from every species coming forward to thank Kyle personally. There were warriors and scientists and artists and leaders, and they all said that Kyle had inspired them to be better. A young Krell warrior said she wanted to be like Kyle and choose compassion over violence. A synthetic said Kyle had helped it understand emotions. A merchant said Kyle had shown that some things could not be bought. That night, Kyle and Lyra returned to Etheria and walked through the glowing forest that Kyle had come to love. Ember and Frost flew above them playing, and their joy was infectious. Lyra told Kyle that she wanted to show him something, and she led him to a clearing where there was a small house built in human style. Lyra said she had built it for Kyle so he would always have a piece of earth with him. Inside were pictures of his mother and his old neighborhood and furniture that looked like what he had owned in Chicago. Kyle was so touched, he could not speak. Lyra said she knew Kyle missed his home sometimes, and she wanted him to know that it was okay to miss it while also loving his new life. Kyle pulled Lyra close and told her that home was not a place anymore. It was her and Ember and Frost and the friends he had made and the work he was doing. He said Chicago would always be part of him, but his future was here among the stars. They sat together in the small house that night and talked about their dreams and plan. Ember and Frost curled up beside them, and everyone felt content and safe. Kyle thought about the scared man he had been a year ago, eating instant noodles in a freezing apartment, and he barely recognized that person. He had grown and learned and become someone who mattered, not because he was powerful or rich or famous, but because he had chosen kindness when it mattered most. The galaxy continued to change and grow, and there were still problems and conflicts and struggles, but there was also hope and cooperation and friendship between species that had never talked before. Kyle worked every day to maintain that peace, and Lyra ruled with wisdom and compassion, and together they built something beautiful. Years passed, and Kyle and Lyra got married in a ceremony that combined Starborn and human traditions and was attended by beings from across the galaxy. Ember and Frost served as guardians, and they had grown so large they had to stay outside the building. Kyle wore a suit from Earth, and Lyra wore traditional Starborn robes, and they promised to love each other for as long as they lived. They had children eventually, 3 of them who were half human and half Starborn, and they were beautiful and unique, and they grew up learning about both cultures. Ember and Frost bonded with the children too and protected them fiercely. The children played with young aliens and learned languages and customs, and they represented the future of a united galaxy.